People say the carnival shut down because of money or safety violations or bad timing, but no one talks about the ride that never finished or why the land swallowed everything except the feeling that something is still moving out there, waiting for the next person to step forward. People around here don't talk about the carnival anymore, not because they've forgotten it, but because forgetting feels safer, like leaving a door closed instead of checking what's still standing behind it. And I didn't understand that until the night I found the rusted tracks half buried behind a wall of trees that shouldn't have been there, because old maps showed open land and parking lots, not forest thick enough to swallow sound. And when I followed the service road past a faded welcome sign with peeling paint, the air felt heavier, quieter, like the land was actively holding something in. And that's where the carnival used to be before it shut down overnight without explanation. Rides abandoned mid-season, tickets still in booths, lights left hanging like someone planned to come back and never did. And the official reasons changed every year. Fire hazards, zoning issues, money problems. But none of them explained why locals avoided the highway exit after dark, or why older residents went silent whenever someone mentioned the ride behind the Ferris wheel, the one never shown on maps or brochures, a small looping coaster known only as the night ride, which according to rumor, never ran during the day and never let anyone ride alone. And I found its track by accident, following a low metallic groan in the wind until the forest went unnaturally still, revealing cars chained together, paint flaking, restraints locked as if holding passengers who hadn't stood up yet. And what unsettled me most was that the cars weren't parked at the station, but frozen mid-curve, as if the ride had simply stopped deciding where it was going. And then I saw the control booth light glowing faintly, even though the power had been cut years ago. A tired flicker that pulled me closer despite every instinct telling me to leave. And inside the booth, there was no operator, just dust-covered controls and a yellowed sign taped to the glass that read, "Last ride, must finish." And before I could step back, the chain lift clicked to life, the nearest car rolling forward just enough for the safety bar to slam down on its own, locking me in as the ride dragged upward, slowly, deliberately, the forest sinking beneath me, while the sky above looked darker than it should have been, heavy and unmoving. And the higher I climbed, the more I felt like I wasn't alone, not beside me, but behind my eyes, as if something else was watching the track through my vision. And as the coaster creaked through its turns, I noticed every restraint ahead of me was locked, names carved deep into the metal, some overlapping, some familiar, and the wind carried murmurs that weren't screams or laughter, but unfinished sentences looping over one another, repeating the same quiet assurance, almost done, until the ride climbed one final incline and stopped completely. No sound, no movement, no air, suspended long enough for me to realize the ride wasn't broken, it had been waiting. And when it lurched forward again, it didn't return to the station, but entered a tunnel lined with mirrors, reflecting versions of me that moved out of sync, smiling when I wasn't, watching when I tried not to. And at the far end of the tunnel, the station lights glowed, and a man in a faded uniform stood beside the controls, his face worn smooth and tired. And when the car finally slowed, he leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for finishing it." And the safety bar lifted, the lights went out, and I stumbled back into the forest alone, gasping, shaking, with no carnival behind me, no tracks, no clearing, only trees and silence. And I want to believe that was the end of it, that the ride finally completed whatever it had been carrying all these years. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind sounds like metal shifting and the world goes very quiet, I can't help wondering what happens if the night ride ever starts again, and whether finishing it once was enough. I tried to convince myself that the night ride was finished after that night, that whatever had been trapped there had finally been released. But the problem with places like that is they don't disappear all at once. They linger in smaller, quieter ways. And I started noticing them weeks later in conversations that stopped too suddenly, in people who mentioned the carnival without realizing they had, in an old news clipping that resurfaced online showing a different aerial photo of the area where the forest now stood, one that clearly outlined a looping track that no longer existed. And then there were the reports, not official ones, just fragments scattered across forums and local message boards, people claiming they'd heard mechanical sounds in the woods after midnight, a slow, rhythmic clanking that didn't match any trains or logging equipment. And one post in particular caught my attention because it mentioned something I hadn't told anyone: the restraints locked down on empty seats, and the writers said they'd gone looking for the sound out of curiosity, found nothing but trees and rusted bolts in the dirt. But when they turned to leave, they felt something behind them move. Not chasing, not threatening, just repositioning itself like it was adjusting to a new presence. And after that night, their dreams filled with the sensation of being pulled uphill, slowly, endlessly, never reaching the drop. And the strangest part was that these people weren't disappearing. They were staying, walking around exhausted and distracted, like they were carrying unfinished momentum inside them. And I began to suspect the night ride didn't need the carnival anymore, that finishing the track once may have loosened something rather than ending it. Because rides are built to repeat, not to stop. And if you leave a ride without a station, without a proper end, it keeps searching for one. And last night, while driving past the old exit out of habit, I noticed a temporary road sign that hadn't been there before, half-reflective, barely readable, pointing toward the trees. And written beneath the arrow in the same shaky lettering I remembered was a message I hadn't seen until now: "Next riders board here." And I don't know if that sign was meant for me or for whoever comes looking next, but what worries me most is the thought that the night ride may no longer be waiting in one place at all, that it's learning how to assemble itself piece by piece wherever someone is willing to step forward and see how far the track goes this time. After the sign appeared, I started paying closer attention to the kinds of people who lingered near the edges of things, the ones who stood a little too long at crosswalks, who hesitated before stepping onto escalators, who watched amusement rides cycle without ever boarding, because there's a certain look people get when momentum has already chosen them and they just haven't realized it yet. And I began noticing it more often than I was comfortable with, especially in places where there shouldn't have been any connection at all, like a temporary fair set up in a mall parking lot with no listed rides on the flyer, or a children's festival where the generator noise dipped every so often into that same slow, familiar clank I remembered from the woods. And when I asked around discreetly, pretending curiosity, people mentioned rides that didn't appear on schedules, attractions that were only running late, staff members who didn't wear matching uniforms and never seemed to leave their stations. And one night, I received an email from someone who claimed they'd boarded something they couldn't fully describe. Just a short ride, barely a loop, assembled behind a row of food trucks, where the safety bar locked a second longer than it should have, long enough for them to feel that awful upward pull in their chest, the sense of being carried rather than moving. And they said when the ride ended, everything looked the same, but felt unfinished, like they'd stepped off before the story decided what came next. And since then, they'd been hearing it at night. Not loudly, not clearly, just the suggestion of motion in stillness, the promise of a track continuing somewhere nearby. And what unsettles me most is that the reports don't describe fear anymore, just familiarity, a growing sense of obligation, like the ride isn't hunting people so much as reminding them of something they already agreed to. And I can't stop thinking about what the operator said to me that night. Not, "Thank you for riding," not, "Thank you for staying," but, "Thank you for finishing it." Because finishing implies there are still rides in progress, still tracks incomplete, still passengers suspended somewhere between ascent and release. And if the night ride is learning how to exist without a fixed location, if it can form wherever there's hesitation and machinery and a person willing to step forward just to see what happens, then the question isn't whether it will start again, but how many times it already has, quietly, temporarily, leaving behind people who feel a little heavier inside, like they're still being pulled uphill towards something they haven't seen yet, something that doesn't need a carnival to keep going anymore. I stopped thinking of the night ride as a single attraction after that, because the more I listened to the stories people sent me, the clearer it became that whatever had started in that abandoned carnival was no longer bound to rails or locations. It was bound to movement itself, or more precisely, to the moment just before movement begins. And the people who wrote to me weren't thrill seekers or urban explorers. They were ordinary, exhausted people who described the same subtle invitation in different ways. A temporary platform assembled overnight behind a closed store. A ride tucked into the far corner of a traveling fair that no one else seemed to notice. A maintenance gate left open just long enough to suggest it was meant to be used. And what all of them shared wasn't terror, but hesitation, that lingering pause where curiosity outweighs instinct. And once that balance tipped, the ride appeared to finish itself around them. Metal where there hadn't been metal, restraints where there hadn't been seats, and always the same sensation as the car began to move. Not speed, not thrill, but ascent. A slow, deliberate pull that made them feel lighter and heavier at the same time. Like gravity was being negotiated rather than obeyed, and several people mentioned seeing others seated ahead of them. Not clearly, not enough to describe faces, just impressions of posture and weight, silhouettes that felt occupied even when the seats looked empty. And none of them remembered a full loop, just the climb, the pause at the top, the sense of something checking whether they were ready to continue. And when the ride ended, if it ended at all, they returned to normal places that looked slightly rearranged. Exits shifted, sounds dampened, reflections delayed, as though the world itself had adjusted to accommodate something unfinished. And I began to wonder if the original night ride hadn't trapped people so much as trained them, teaching them how to exist mid-motion, how to carry that suspended state back into the world. Because over time, their messages changed tone, less confusion, less fear, more inevitability. Phrases like, "I think it's waiting for me again," or "I don't feel done yet." And one person admitted they'd gone back deliberately, following that internal pull late at night until they found another ride forming where nothing had been hours earlier. And that terrified me more than any scream could have. Because it meant the night ride didn't just appear to people, it responded to them, recognized something unfinished inside them, and offered continuation. And I keep thinking about the operator, the way he looked relieved rather than threatening, the way his gratitude felt practiced, as if he'd said it many times before. And I can't shake the idea that he wasn't thanking me for freeing him, but for taking his place. Because if a ride exists only to keep moving, then someone has to remain behind to ensure it never stops. And lately I've been feeling it too, that familiar upward pull when I stand too long at the edge of things, that quiet suggestion that something is nearly ready, that a platform is being assembled somewhere just out of sight. And I don't know whether resisting it keeps the night ride from finishing what it started, or whether hesitation is exactly what it needs to grow stronger. But if you've ever felt that moment when the world seems to lean forward before you do, when something feels prepared to carry you whether you consent or not, then you might already be closer to it than you think. Because rides don't always announce themselves anymore. Sometimes they just wait until you're standing still long enough to wonder what would happen if you stepped forward and let the motion decide the rest. I started to realize that the night ride wasn't just appearing to individuals anymore. It was shaping patterns, subtly reorganizing spaces and routines so that hesitation became unavoidable. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere, in the way temporary structures lingered longer than scheduled, in how certain machines hummed even when unplugged, in how crowds naturally thinned at the edges of events until only a few people remained standing where something might fit. And the messages I received began reflecting that shift too. People no longer describing a single ride, but a sequence, fragments of motion stitched together across nights, a short lift here, a pause there, the sense of being returned unfinished again and again, like the ride was no longer asking for one complete journey, but collecting it in pieces. And what frightened me most was how calm the riders sounded as they adjusted to this, how they described learning when to wait, when to step forward, when to let the machinery finish assembling around them, because some of them began to recognize each other without ever meeting, noticing familiar silhouettes in reflections, sensing shared momentum in crowded places. As if they were all on the same track, but at different points along it, and one message arrived that I still haven't answered, from someone who claimed they'd found a control panel without a ride attached to it, just a small booth standing alone behind a warehouse, switches worn smooth, indicator lights flickering patiently, and taped to the glass was a list of names written in cramped handwriting, some crossed out, some circled, some still blank. And the sender said when they touched the controls, they felt that same upward pull settle into their shoulders, not forcing them to act, just reminding them that something was in progress. And I understood then that the night ride didn't need operators or passengers in the way we think. It needed roles, positions in a system that keeps motion from collapsing into rest. And maybe that's why the original Carnival emptied so quickly, why the land swallowed it so completely, because once a place gives itself over to unfinished movement, it doesn't need spectacle anymore. It only needs people willing to pause long enough to feel the pull and decide whether to step into it or become part of what waits behind. And lately I've been dreaming less about the ride itself and more about the station, the quiet moments between cycles, the way everything feels suspended just before someone arrives, and when I wake up, there's always that same lingering sense that something, somewhere, is nearly ready to continue, and that all it needs now is for the right person to realize they've already been standing in the queue longer than they remember. I think I understand it now. Not all at once, but the way you understand something only after it's already passed through you. Because the night ride was never meant to end the way we imagine endings, with a final scream or collapse or disappearance. It was meant to settle, to distribute itself so completely that no one could point to where it began or where it stopped. And that's why the Carnival vanished, why the tracks dissolved, why the rides learned how to assemble anywhere there was hesitation. Because motion doesn't need spectacle once it becomes habit, and the people who rode it weren't taken, they were finished. Each one carrying a piece of that unfinished descent back into the world until the ride no longer needed rails or cars or booths at all, just moments where people pause before stepping forward. And I know this because the messages have stopped now, not abruptly, not ominously, just naturally, like a process that no longer needs monitoring, and the pull I used to feel has faded too, replaced by something quieter, something like acceptance. And when I pass places where a ride could form, empty lots, loading docks, half-lit corners of festivals, I don't feel fear anymore, only recognition, because the night ride isn't waiting for passengers now. It's already moving, slowly, constantly, carried by the way people hesitate, the way they linger, the way they stand on the edge of decisions longer than necessary. And if you've ever felt that subtle pressure urging you forward when nothing is visibly pushing you, if you've ever wondered why stopping feels harder than continuing, then you've already ridden it without realizing. And that's the part no one tells you, the part the operator never had to explain. Because the last ride doesn't happen in a place you can abandon. It happens in the moment you realize you were never standing still to begin with.